Settle in, let the day fall away, and allow your thoughts to drift gently into another time. Tonight, we will journey far from the rhythms of modern life and step quietly into the slow and steady world of the medieval countryside. The sounds of machinery and traffic fade, replaced by the rustle of wind through thatched roofs, the gentle creak of worn wooden carts, and the faint clinking of metal on stone as a blacksmith tends his forge. This is a story not of lords or kings, but of women specifically, the women whose lives were shaped by the cycles of the land, of family, and of the body. We will explore what it meant to give birth as a peasant woman in medieval Europe, a world where medicine was entwined with superstition, where pain was expected, and where survival, not comfort, defined daily experience. But do not expect tales of high drama or agony. Instead, we will walk slowly through the soft corners of that reality, through dim candle-lit rooms, herbal infusions, whispered prayers, and the quiet endurance of women who lived and died by the rhythms of nature. You won't need to hold on to anything too tightly. Just let the history unfold as you relax. Let us begin with the everyday life of a peasant woman before the labor pains ever began. You wake before dawn, the air still thick with the cold damp of the night. The thatched roof above your head does little to block the morning chill, and the hearth's warmth has long since faded. Your eyes adjust to the grey light seeping in through wooden shutters. All around you, the home stirs the smell of last night's ash, the low bleating of animals just outside, and the hushed whisper of breath from children asleep on straw-stuffed mattresses. As a peasant woman in the Middle Ages, your life is bound to cycles of seasons, of sowing and harvest, of births and deaths. You rise early not because you choose to, but because there is much to do, and never enough time. You tend to animals, gather eggs, fetch water from the well. You prepare coarse bread from grain, you ground by hand the night before. You wear a simple woolen gown, perhaps slightly itchy against your skin, and a linen cap to hold back your hair. These are not fashionable garments, but they are durable, passed down, patched often. Pregnancy comes often, sometimes as early as your mid-teens. It is not a celebrated milestone in the way modern society might think. There is little ceremony. It is simply what happens. You notice the signs missed cycles, swelling belly, the soft shifting of life within. There is no doctor to visit, no test to take. You know because your body tells you, and the women around you have taught you how to listen. Your days do not lighten because you carry a child. You continue your labor-carrying bundles of firewood, churning butter, weeding the fields. Perhaps a neighbor takes on some of your work in the final month, but often your tasks remain until you physically cannot complete them. Fatigue settles in your bones, but you press forward. There are mouths to feed, and your absence would be noticed more by the unfinished chores than by any gesture of sympathy. Meals are simple: dark rye bread, pottage made from beans, cabbage, and whatever herbs you could forage. If you're fortunate, a bit of dried meat or a piece of cheese adds variety. You eat not for pleasure, but to keep your strength, your body quietly dividing its energy between sustaining your life and building another within. The notion of privacy does not exist as you might know it. Families sleep in single-room cottages, often alongside their animals for warmth. Conversations happen openly, bodies are familiar, and the needs of one member quickly become the concern of all. You have likely witnessed other births before your own, not in hushed hospitals but in open homes. You've seen women scream, cry, or simply go silent as contractions rack their bodies. Your pregnancy is observed quietly by the community. There is both hope and caution. Many women do not survive childbirth. Many children do not live past infancy. There is joy in the anticipation of new life, but it is tempered by the constant presence of death. You might carry a token of protection, a charm, a carved piece of wood, or a cross around your neck. You might whisper prayers to saints, or follow old herbal traditions passed down from your mother and her mother before her. When night comes, you sit by the fire, your swollen belly illuminated by flickering light. Your hands never rest long, always occupied sewing, mending, shelling beans. You talk softly with other women. They do not sugarcoat what lies ahead. They speak of pain, of the strength required, of the quiet courage you must summon. They remind you of who will be there when the time comes, other mothers, neighbors, perhaps a local midwife if one is nearby. You do not write about these days. You leave no journals or letters, but the rhythms of your life are etched into the walls of your home, into the paths between cottage and well, into the fading lines of your palms. Childbirth, for a medieval peasant woman, is not an event set apart. It is one more chapter in a life defined by endurance. And as your time draws near, the pace of your world does not slow, but within you, something ancient begins to stir, a sense of readiness, of apprehension, of resignation. And all around you, the village breathes in unison, as it has for generations, waiting for the moment when a new voice may join the world. The day arrives, not with fanfare, but with a dull, insistent ache. You feel it first in the lower back, then deep within your abdomen, a slow tightening, a reminder that the time has come. There is no rush to a clinic, no sterile white sheets or electronic monitors. Instead, you send word quietly to the other women in the village, perhaps with a child dispatched barefoot across dirt paths. And then, you wait. The room in which you will give birth is the same space where you eat, sleep, and pray. It is dim, the only light coming from a small fire in the hearth or a few tallow candles flickering on a wooden table. Smoke clings to the beams of the ceiling, curling slowly upward before drifting out through the thatch. The air is heavy with the scent of herbs, lavender to calm the nerves, yarrow to encourage strength, and sage, believed to ward off evil spirits. Other women arrive with calm efficiency. Perhaps your mother, an older sister, a neighbor who has seen many births, a midwife, if your village is fortunate enough to have one, might be called upon. Her hands are practiced, her words few. She brings with her a leather pouch filled with tools and tonic spits of bone-carved talismans, tightly bundled herbs, and simple instruments wrapped in cloth. You lie on a straw mattress or lean against a low stool. Sometimes, births take place on hands and knees, or seated over a birthing chair with a hollowed center. There are no rigid rules-only positions that experience has shown to help. No one counts contractions aloud, or checks dilation with a gloved hand. Instead, they watch your face, your posture, your breathing. Centuries of instinct and shared wisdom pass silently from one generation to the next. There is pain, deep, exhausting, ancient pain, but there is no expectation that it will be dulled. You grit your teeth, perhaps moan or cry out, but no one tells you to be quiet. No one tells you to breathe differently, or pushes medication into your veins. Instead, a hand may rest gently on your shoulder, another may press a damp cloth to your forehead. Voices murmur softly around you, not instructions, but encouragement. You are not alone. As labor progresses, the room becomes warmer. The fire burns steadily, and steam rises from the clay basin where cloths are soaked in hot water. Sometimes, the midwife ties strips of linen around your thighs or belly to support you. Sometimes, she chants low incantations believed to ease the way. Herbs like rue and mugwort are burned or brewed into tea, their bitter scent clinging to the air. The moment of birth does not announce itself suddenly. It builds wave after wave until your body can no longer resist. Then, quietly, through effort and instinct, the child emerges. Perhaps it is quick, or perhaps it takes long hours. In either case, the result is the same. A small, slippery form, drawn gently into the world by calloused hands. There is no loud crying at first. The newborn is wiped with a cloth, swaddled in old linen, and held close to your chest. The cord is tied with twine or thread, then cut with a small knife or shears. If the baby is slow to breathe, a bit of cold water may be dashed on its feet, or the midwife may whisper a prayer into its ear. Then comes the afterbirth, another wave of discomfort. often overlooked yet equally important. The midwife watches closely for bleeding, for signs of retained placenta, for complications that could still claim your life. If all is well, she might brew a tisane of raspberry leaf or motherwort to help your body recover. She might massage your abdomen, bind your belly with cloth, and finally help you into a fresh shift. Around you, the room begins to still. The fire settles into embers. The midwife tidies her tools, rinses cloths, and stirs the basin of water. Your helpers may sing quietly, or simply hum as they work. If night has fallen, someone might hang a charm above the door, or sprinkle salt in the corners of the room, a gesture of protection, passed down through custom rather than scripture. Your baby lies against you, wrapped and drowsing. You feel no elation, not yet, only weariness, deep and bone-heavy. Your body trembles with effort, your mind fogged with pain and relief. There are no photographs, no announcements, no balloons or flowers, only silence, only rest. For now, your work is done, but the days ahead will be long. Breastfeeding must begin soon. The child must be watched closely for signs of illness. You must recover quickly. There are fields to tend, fires to stoke, bread to knead. The world will not pause. Still, for this brief moment, the room is hushed, the child is safe, and a single candle flickers beside your bed, casting a pool of gentle light that dances along the wall. Outside, the village sleeps, unaware that one more soul has joined the centuries-old rhythm of life and death, labor and rest, joy and sorrow. As you rest with the infant nestled against your breast, the midwife remains close, tidying her tools with slow, practiced hands. Her presence is both comforting and enigmatic. In medieval peasant communities, midwives held a unique and often contradictory position, revered for their knowledge, yet regarded with cautious suspicion, especially by the church and those in authority. She is not a physician. That role belongs to men trained in the cities, far removed from the muddy lanes and thatched cottages of your world. She is not a nun or a nurse, but something older and earthbound, an inheritor of secrets passed not through books, but through whispered teachings and decades of lived experience. She knows how to coax a breech baby into place using her hands alone. She knows which herbs ease cramping, which roots must never be brewed, and how to read the color of blood to tell if danger is near. Some midwives are women of middle years, respected and motherly. Others are old, their bodies curved like the sickles they use in harvest. In larger villages, the same midwife may have delivered every child for years. She is known intimately by the community, though never quite embraced. Her work is necessary but liminal between life and death, between flesh and spirit. The church, particularly in the later Middle Ages, grew uneasy with the influence such women wielded. In a world where childbirth was deeply physical, yet steeped in spiritual anxiety, the midwife's presence blurred lines. She spoke words not found in scripture. She performed rituals that mingled Christian prayers with older, folk beliefs. And though many were pious women, attending Mass and confessing regularly, their role at the bedside made clerics uneasy. In some regions, bishops required midwives to swear oaths promises, not to perform pagan rites, not to baptize infants unless death was imminent, not to whisper charms or use amulets unless sanctioned by Holy Writ. And yet, behind closed doors, old customs persisted. A poppy hung above the door, an iron key placed under the pillow to ward off malicious spirits, a line of salt traced across the threshold to protect mother and child from the unseen. Despite suspicions, when the pains of labor began, it was to the midwife that women turned. Her arrival brought structure and hope. She knew when to wait and when to act. She recognized the sounds that meant progression, those that foretold tragedy. Her toolkit was modest, but symbolic. Linen cloths boiled clean in a pot over the fire, a sharp blade wrapped in waxed cloth, simple wooden spoons for broth or herbal infusions, perhaps a small book of prayers, worn thin at the edges. She carried none of the status of noble doctors, No credentials, no payment but food or labor. Yet, for the women she served, she was the only help that mattered. If complications arose, bleeding that would not stop, a baby that would not breathe, there were few options. There was no transportation to distant cities, no surgical remedies. The midwife would do all she could. Press her palms into your belly to slow the blood, offer hot compresses soaked in wine or vinegar, speak softly to calm you, and if all else failed, remain at your side until the final breath was drawn. And yet, in many cases, the outcome was life. The baby survived, the mother recovered, and it was the midwife who made it so. After the birth, she often stayed through the night, tending both mother and child, preparing a gruel from oats or a broth with wild garlic and bone. She would monitor the baby's suckling, watch the mother's pallor, speak briefly with the husband, and prepare the bed for the long days of recovery to come. Only once her duties were done would she leave quietly, without thanks, slipping away before sunrise, perhaps already called to another home, another labor, another flickering candle in the night. In the public eye, her work was seldom praised, but among the women of the village, her name was passed down like a sacred promise. She was the keeper of calm in chaos, the one who stood between life and loss. Without her, many would not live to see the next harvest. And so, in the story of childbirth in the medieval countryside, the midwife remains a central figure, not adorned in robes, not remembered in books, but written into the lives of countless children whose first breath began in her hands. In the quiet hours after birth, as the fire dimmed and the baby slept curled against its mother, the air inside a medieval cottage was often thick, not only with wood smoke but with belief in things seen and unseen, tangible and imagined. In a world where death loomed close and survival was fragile, childbirth was never just a biological event. It was a moment suspended between realms, watched over by saints, spirits, and unseen forces that could bless or curse with equal ease. To give birth in the Middle Ages was to walk through a spiritual threshold. Women were believed to be vulnerable not only physically, but metaphysically open to harm from dark entities or malevolent influences. Stories passed from mother to daughter spoke of spirits that lingered outside windows, eager to steal a newborn's breath, or witches who might curse an unborn child if offended. These fears were not fringe ideas, they were part of everyday thinking, woven into the very rhythm of life. As such, many women and their families took precautions, small rituals and gestures meant to shield mother and infant from the unseen. A knife might be placed beneath the bed, not for use, but for protection. Iron was thought to repel evil, so a nail or horseshoe might be hung near the doorframe. Bells, too, had their place, note the great bells of a church, but small ones, tied with red thread and placed near the baby's head. Salt, a precious commodity, was often sprinkled across thresholds or placed in tiny pouches beneath pillows. It was believed to purify and preserve, not just food, but souls. Water blessed by a priester in urgent cases, by the midwife herself, might be kept nearby, ready to baptize a baby who showed signs of struggle, lest it perish unbaptized and unprotected from eternal limbo. Names were carefully chosen. Sometimes, a baby might be named after a saint associated with healing or safe passage. Saint Margaret, the protector of mothers in labor, or Saint Anne, the mother of Mary. If a child followed a string of miscarriages or stillbirths, they might be named in a way that tricked death given, a name meant to sound weak or common, so as not to draw the envy or attention of spirits. Even the placenta and afterbirth carried meaning. In some regions it was buried near the home, sometimes beneath the threshold or near the hearth, to ensure the child's spirit would always find its way home. In other places it might be burned, or fed to animals, or simply buried quietly to prevent its use in harmful spells. Prayer too played a central role. The Lord's Prayer was often recited during labor, sometimes in rhythm with breathing, and saints were called upon not just for divine aid, but for strength and courage. The line between medicine and faith was fluid. Herbs were gathered on certain feast days, or only under the light of a waxing moon. The success of a birth was not seen solely as the result of the mother's strength or the midwife's skill, but as a gift or trial given by God. When things went well, thanks were offered. A candle might be lit in the village chapel, or a coin placed in a poor box. The mother might wear a small cross for the weeks following birth, a token of gratitude and protection during her recovery. If things went poorly, if the child was lost, or the mother fell ill, it was seen not only as tragedy, but perhaps punishment, or the result of some unseen transgression. A forgotten prayer, a broken taboo, a wrong word spoken to the wrong person. It's important to understand that these beliefs were not foolish superstitions to those who held them. They were tools, emotional, spiritual, communal, for making sense of the incomprehensible. In a world without modern medicine, without certainty, they brought order, they brought meaning. And so, birth in the medieval countryside was not merely a physical trial, was a spiritual event, rich with symbolism and sacred significance. It was wrapped in fear, yes, but also in wonder. It was a testament to faith, to resilience, and to the deep, often unspoken belief that life was not just of the body, but also of the soul. As the first cries of a newborn filled the low chamber of a peasant's home, the women gathered there did not think only of motherhood. They thought of saints, of omens, of the will of God, and the fragile thread that connected the living to the dead, the earthly to the divine. And somewhere beyond the fields and footpaths, the church bells might toll faintly in the distance, marking time, blessing the moment, or perhaps simply calling the village to prayer, as it always had, and always would. The ordeal of birth, though complete, marked not an end, but the beginning of another quiet challenge: recovery. In the medieval countryside, the period following childbirth was known not in medical terms, but simply as the lying-in, a time of seclusion, stillness, and slow healing, during which the new mother retreated from the rhythms of daily life. For 6 weeks, if circumstances allowed, a woman was expected to rest. In practice, the length and quality of this recovery varied greatly depending on her family's needs, her own health, and the season. If the baby was born during harvest or planting, even the first days of rest might be short. But in quieter months, or with generous kin nearby, the mother might be allowed to remain in or near bed for some time, tending only to the infant and herself. During this period, she was considered to be in a liminal state, neither fully part of the household's daily life, nor fully apart from it. Her body was seen as open, still in flux. The womb, in medieval understanding, was not just a physical space, but a vessel that needed time to close again, to cleanse and restore. Bleeding after birth was expected and watched carefully. If it continued too long, it was feared. If it stopped too soon, it was also cause for concern. Food during this time was carefully chosen. Warm broths, soft porridge, spiced wine or mead in small amounts, all believed to restore warmth and strength. Cold food, or anything too sour or bitter, was avoided. The balance of the body's humour shot, cold, wet, dry, was a core part of medieval medical thought, and after birth, a woman was seen as especially susceptible to imbalance. Therefore, warmth was essential. Warm drinks, warm clothing, warm beds, and warm thoughts. Laughter and calm conversation were encouraged. Arguments or distressing stories were not. Bathing was rare, but warm compresses or sponge cleanings might be offered. Linen cloths were changed as often as the household could afford, and fresh straw or fleece laid beneath her when possible. The midwife or another experienced woman might return several times to check her pulse, her colour, or the firmness of her abdomen, though there were no charts or written notes, only memory and observation. Emotionally, the period could be both comforting and isolating. Visitors came and went, but often only women. Men, including husbands, were not always present during the recovery, especially in the early days. There was a belief part spiritual, part social that a woman's presence during this time was different, sacred in a way that was not meant to be disturbed. Only after she had been ritually cleansed and blessed could she fully return to communal life. This rite, known in many Christian regions as churching, marked the end of the lying in. Usually held about 40 days after birth, it was a short service during which the mother returned to church, gave thanks for her survival, and was symbolically purified. She might carry a candle, wear her cleanest gown, and walk slowly beside other mothers who had recently given birth. The priest would speak words of blessing, and with that, she was once again fully part of village, lifeable to attend mass, work in the fields, and be seen publicly without hesitation. Yet, not every woman reached this stage. Some did not survive the weeks after birth. Infection, hemorrhage, or exhaustion could take their toll silently, often in the night. For those who did recover, the process was slow, shaped by necessity more than design. Each day, a little more movement, a few more tasks mending, feeding chickens, eventually carrying firewood or returning to the fields with the infant wrapped in cloth and tied to the body. The newborn, too, was watched constantly, swaddled tightly in linen strips to keep limbs straight and safe. The baby was rarely left alone. Cradles were small, often homemade, lined with fleece or straw. Mothers slept near their children, fed them when they cried, and learned their signals quickly. Though few wrote these things down, the knowledge passed as it always had, through repetition and whispered wisdom. The lying in, then, was not just a recovery from labour. It was a re-emergence, a time in which a woman slowly reclaimed her body, her place, and her number no longer simply the mother in labour, but herself once more, though changed. And outside, life continued. The seasons rolled forward, the fields waited, the animals stirred, but for a short while, a quiet corner of the cottage remained still, marked by the low murmur of a lullaby, the scent of warm broth, and the soft sighs of two beings, bound together, beginning again. In the medieval countryside, the cry of a newborn was both a blessing and a worry. For every birth, joy was tempered by a solemn understanding. The earliest days of life were the most perilous. The fragility of infancy loomed heavily over families, and few took survival for granted. In many places, a third or more of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. From the moment of birth, a new life was touched by the twin forces of love and fear. The mother held her child close, swaddled in strips of linen, not just for warmth, but to keep their limbs properly formed, according to the understanding of the time. The baby slept in a wooden cradle-leaf. The family could afford on a soft bed of straw, tucked tightly beside the mother at night. Breastfeeding began immediately if possible, and though there were no formal instructions or lactation consultants, generations of practice gave women the knowledge they needed. Yet dangers abounded. Some were visible fevers, coughs, fits. Others were less easily explained. A child who seemed well one evening might be gone by morning. Without knowledge of germs or viruses, explanations turned to what could be observed or believed. A cold draught, a sour food, a malicious spirit, or a broken taboo might be blamed. Illness was mysterious, often perceived as punishment, misfortune, or fate. To protect the child, many measures were taken, some practical, others symbolic. Babies were rarely left alone. Charms were sewn into their wrappings, or small relics tied near their cradles. If a child seemed unwell, remedies might be brewed from local herbs: fennel for digestion, chamomile for rest, willow bark for fever. But just as often, families turned to spiritual intervention. A quick trip to the village priest, or the burning of incense and whispered prayers, might accompany the administration of a healing draught. Baptism was urgent and essential. According to church teachings, a child who died unbaptized risked being denied entry to heaven. This fear led many families to baptize their children as soon as possible, sometimes within hours of birth, especially if signs of weakness appeared. If a priest could not arrive in time, a midwife or another layperson might perform an emergency baptism using plain water and the proper words. It was believed that even this unsanctioned act could ensure the child's soul found peace. Names carried weight. Often, babies who were sickly or born after previous losses were given names of saints, or even the same name as a deceased sibling. In some cases, children were not named at all until several days had passed, a quiet custom, reflecting the uncertainty of those early hours. To name a child too soon was seen by some as inviting grief. In more prosperous homes, wet nurses might care for infants, particularly if the mother was too ill to nurse. But among peasants, this was rare. The mother's milk was the only nourishment, and if it failed, the alternatives were few goat's milk, perhaps, or a thin gruel made from grains. But these substitutes lacked vital nutrients and were not sterile, making illness more likely. Dehydration, colic, and simple malnutrition claimed many. If a child died, mourning was subdued but deeply felt. There were no miniature coffins carved with angels, no elaborate ceremonies. The body was washed, wrapped, and buried quickly, often in consecrated ground if possible. Mothers grieved quietly, often while tending to other children or preparing meals. Life demanded that sorrow be folded into routine. Still, not all was despair. Many infants survived. Their first steps, their first words, their growth into strong-limbed children brought quiet celebration. Every healthy milestone was a victory, acknowledged in soft smiles and small gestures, a carved toy, a ribbon, a sweet biscuit saved from the table. And in this balance between loss and endurance lay the rhythm of medieval parenthood. Children were precious, but not romanticized. They were seen as both gifts and burdens, sources of joy and anxiety. The realities of high mortality did not diminish the love parents felt, but it did shape how that love was shown. Less in words, more in actions. A mother might not sing lullabies every night, but she would rise early to feed her child, share the warmest blanket, keep them close in winter's cold. A father might not cradle the infant tenderly, but he would mend the roof to keep the rain out and walk miles to find medicine or food. Through all of this, the village itself acted as a net. Older women watched newborns as mothers rested. Children were passed from one lap to another, not only within families but among neighbors. Illness or misfortune was not born alone. In this web of shared care, resilience was built not just of body, but of spirit. So, though the threat of death hung close, so too did the force of life. Against all odds, many infants grew strong, toddled into the sunshine, learned the ways of the world. And in those earliest days, when the flickering candle of life burned most delicately, a mother's quiet watchfulness and the village's steady rhythm kept it alight. As days turned to weeks, the new mother gradually re-entered the rhythm of village life. Yet she did not do so alone. In the medieval countryside, motherhood was never an isolated journey. It was shared, woven tightly into the bonds of kinship, neighborly ties, and communal duty. Each birth was personal, yet also profoundly collective. A child belonged first to a family, but also to the village that surrounded and sustained it. In this world, few tasks were undertaken in solitude. You rose with the dawn not simply for your own family, but to contribute to the broader labor that kept the community alive. Women worked together planting flax, washing linens in the stream, spinning wool by firelight. These were not merely chores, but opportunities for the sharing of wisdom, laughter, and support. In these circles of female labor, child rearing naturally unfolded. A baby might be passed from mother to aunt, to cousin, to neighbor's daughter, all in the course of a morning's work. Infants were soothed by many arms. Toddlers learned to walk in communal courtyards, their hands reaching for whichever familiar face happened to be closest. Grandmothers and childless women often became second mothers, offering time, experience, and presence. When illness struck her, when a mother faced complications after birth, the community stepped in. Bread was baked by neighbors. Older girls helped fetch water or gather firewood. Herbs were gathered for healing teas, and if grief visited the household, it was met not with distance, but with silent companionship. In times of hardship, the boundaries of family blurred, and survival became a shared goal. Midwives, too, were part of this web knot, just as caretakers during birth, but as familiar presences in the days that followed. They returned to check on mother and child, offered herbs and quiet advice, and sometimes intervened if others gossiped or cast doubt on the outcome of a birth. Their authority was informal but respected, and their visits helped link families across generations. Motherhood also meant entering a particular identity within the social structure. A woman with children had a certain standing, one shaped not by wealth, but by fulfillment of expected roles. Though patriarchy defined the overarching order, motherhood gave women a measure of influence. Their knowledge was essential, their labor irreplaceable, and their participation in birth and child-rearing a form of cultural continuity. This identity brought both pride and pressure. A woman who birthed many healthy children was admired. Her fertility was seen as strength, a sign of divine favor or physical resilience. Yet, the inability to conceive, repeated miscarriages, or the death of a child could lead to whispered judgments. In some places, such misfortunes were seen as bad luck. In others, they stirred darker suspicions of sin, of spiritual weakness, or even of hidden wrongdoing. Religious institutions reinforced some of these views. The Church emphasized the sanctity of motherhood, modeling it after the Virgin Mary's purity and sacrifice. But at the same time, childbirth was often framed as penance for Eve's original sign and act, both necessary and painful, noble, yet tainted. Women were caught between reverence and reproach, venerated as life-givers yet constrained by rigid moral expectations. Yet, outside of doctrine and formality, the daily reality was more nuanced. In the quiet moments while mending a child's tunic, or sitting beside a sleeping baby, mothers found comfort in shared glances, in nods of understanding from other women. There was no need to explain the exhaustion, the fear, the hope. It was known, deeply and collectively. Feast days and seasonal festivals also served as moments of relief and celebration. A child's survival through their first year was marked, if not with ceremony, then at least with extra food, a handmade toy, or special attention. Mothers gathered, exchanged stories, and found solace in the cyclical nature of their lives. As the child grew, the roles shifted. Toddlers joined older siblings in small chores, gathering eggs, chasing off birds from crops, learning the skills that would eventually sustain them. And the mother's tasks evolved in tandem, less about survival, more about shaping the person her child would become. But always, the foundation of her efforts rested on the community around her. Alone, her task would have been crushing. With others, it became bearable. And in that shared labor, medieval motherhood found its strength not in grand declarations or solitary heroism, but in quiet constancy, woven through the daily fabric of peasant life. So when one child was born, the ripples reached far. And when a child thrived, it was not only a family's success, it was a small triumph for an entire village. Though birth itself is a universal experience, the way it unfolded in the medieval world depended greatly on one's social standing. The peasant woman whose story we followed thus far brought her children into the world in cottages of wattle and daub, amid straw, ash, and candlelight. But not far away, in the manors of the nobility or the stone chambers of castles, another kind of birth took place. Yet even in its differences, noble childbirth shared many of the same fears, traditions, and uncertainties. Despite better surroundings, richer foods, and access to learned physicians, no woman, no matter her title, was immune to the dangers of labor. For noble women, pregnancy was still a duty more than a personal milestone. Marriages among the upper classes were strategic, meant to produce heirs and secure alliances. A woman might be wed before she turned 15 and expected to bear her first child within a year. A successful birth meant continuation of lineage, a stronger political position, and, For some, increased influence within the household. The birthing chamber of a noblewoman was more elaborate, but followed its own ritualized preparation. As labor approached, she would withdraw from public life and enter a state known as confinement. Her room would be sealed heavy, drapes drawn, tapestries hung, windows shuttered to create warmth and protect from drafts and evil spirits. The chamber was dark, fragrant with herbs and incense, and often decorated with religious icons. Only women were allowed inside. Ladies, in-waiting, female relatives, and midwives. Men, even husbands, remained outside. The process was hidden, shrouded not only in physical veils, but in layers of social expectation. While peasant births were seen as communal and practical, noble births were wrapped in symbolism and ceremony. Physicians might be present, but their knowledge of childbirth was theoretical, often secondary to the hands-on wisdom of the midwife. Remedies for easing pain or encouraging delivery ranged from refined versions of peasant herbals to more exotic ingredients like powdered pearls or ambergris, depending on the household's wealth and belief in humoral medicine. Despite the wealth and care surrounding them, noblewomen faced the same basic risks as their poorer counterparts: hemorrhage, obstructed labor, infection. In fact, some historians suggest that noblewomen might have had higher mortality rates due to a greater likelihood of multiple births, a more sedentary lifestyle, or the pressures of producing heirs without pause. Yet the outcomes of noble births carried far-reaching consequences. A healthy male heir might mean the continuation of a dynasty. A stillborn child, or a wife's death in labor, could unravel entire political arrangements. The child's birth was often quickly announced with ceremony bells, proclamations, gifts exchanged across estates. The stakes were different, but the emotional weight could be just as heavy. The postnatal period for noblewomen was also marked by ritual. The churching ceremony was conducted with particular formality. Gifts were given, feasts might be held, and the mother's return to society carefully choreographed. Her child would likely be handed over to a wet nursey, common practice among the elite, allowing the mother to resume her social duties and preserve her fertility for future births. Yet even then, bonds between mother and child could remain strong. Letters, where they survive, reveal affection, concern, and deep sorrow when illness or death visited a child's cradle, regardless of wealth. The human experience of motherhood transcended the walls of class. Meanwhile, back in the countryside, peasant women carried on with their work. They gave birth not in enclosed chambers, but in open rooms where chickens sometimes clucked beneath the bed, where the next meal was never far from thought. There were no feasts or formal announcements. A birth might be known to neighbors simply by the smoke rising earlier than usual from the chimney, or by the absence of a woman from the village well. Still, one cannot say that one kind of birth was better than the other. Each brought its own trials, its own expectations, and its own meaning. The noblewoman was swaddled in velvet and prayer, the peasant in wool and work, but both risked their lives. Both labored under the watch of midwives and saints. Both emerged into a world where motherhood changed their place, their body, and their heart. And in that shared transformation, in the silence of night, in the first cry of a newborn, in the soft, trembling breath of a new mother, social distinctions faded. What remained was the oldest story of all, the beginning of life, and the quiet strength of the one who brought it forth. Now, as we return slowly from that distant medieval world, the firelight of the peasant cottage fades into the shadows of memory. The soft rustling of straw underfoot, the murmured prayers over steaming herbal brews, the rhythmic hush of lullaby soul fall into silence once more. Yet the images linger. The labouring mother, in the half-dark, the midwife's steady hands, the newborn's breath, shallow and uncertain, then strong. To reflect on childbirth in the medieval countryside is not merely to study medicine or tradition, it is to glimpse the ordinary courage woven into the lives of women long gone. These were not queens or heroines of epic tales. They left behind no portraits, no scrolls of inked letters. Their names are seldom recorded, and their stories passed down not in books, but in the quiet resilience of generations. Yet their lives built the world. Each birth, each recovery, each whispered song over a cradle was a thread in the tapestry of survival. They endured without applause, without the assurance of safety, without many of the comforts we now take for granted. There was no hospital room, no anesthesia, no trained team to surround and protect, only the warmth of a fire, the presence of other women, and the hope that body and soul would weather the storm once again. What is perhaps most humbling is how ordinary it all was. Birth was not an event to be scheduled or postponed, it simply happened, folded into the daily fabric of life, like drawing water or mending a tunic. And in its ordinariness, there was power, a quiet power, shaped not by dominance or spectacle, but by endurance, cooperation, and care. We often think of history as battles and kings, as cathedrals and revolutions, but within those grand arcs lies this softer story of motherhood in its raw, unadorned form, of the ways women helped each other, how they lived with fear yet still pressed forward, how they welcomed life not with fanfare, but with hands calloused from work and hearts weathered by loss. And while much has changed sterile rooms, advanced medicine, bright overhead lights, the core experience remains tied to that ancient past. There is still anticipation, vulnerability, awe, still the same sacred moment when a new cry breaks the silence, and time seems to pause for a breath. As you lay now, letting your mind wander and rest, perhaps there is comfort in this continuity, that in the still hours of the night, across centuries, mothers have held their children close, whispering promises into the dark, that in your own stillness, you are connected by spirit, by story, by shared humanity, to those quiet rooms and flickering hearths, to those lives lived with courage, and to the timeless mystery of beginnings. Sleep now, with the past gently settled around you like a woolen blanket. The story is done, but its warmth remains. Good night.